Our story begins with the river and the tough-minded people who chose to settle here. They came to Texas looking for land and opportunity. Along the river, they found the land, but the opportunity had to be something of their own creation. Driven by their desire for success, they built this city with the belief that what was good for business was good for Dallas. Many of us, perhaps without even realizing it, travel through these years of history every day, crossing the river, circling the highways, and moving down city streets. It's hard to imagine what it was like years ago, yet the stories live on and give us a deeper sense of the complexity of our community. There's much to learn about and enjoy in the sharing of memories about Big D back when.
Well, it sometimes amazes me when I hear people talk about Dallas, what Dallas is, the kind of city it is, because I found that it's all kinds of cities.
When I think about Big D, I think about Little Mexico and the nurturing that I felt, with the community and all the little businesses in Little Mexico. I think that any time that a child can have that they won't grow up feeling like they're not valued.
Speaking on the Thomas and Hall community, I remember it so well as being so thriving, so robust, so busy. And there was a movie theater, cafe, a barbecue store, churches, neighborhood grocery stores, and everything that a community needed was within a 6-block area there.
So Central Expressway would be what you would call the Central Track.
That used to be Central Track. I used to walk that track many times. I can talk to you about this because I'm one of a few that's left that were really there. See, I was actually there, down on Deep Ellum.
South Dallas, when I grew up, I would say 90% of the Jewish people lived in South Dallas. All the religious institutions were in South Dallas, the kosher butcher shops, the bakeries. Many Jewish establishments were in South Dallas. Most of the neighbors were Jewish, and to me it was a good place to grow up.
There was a real sense of community in Oak Cliff. Everybody knew everybody. It was very safe. As a small boy, I could walk or ride my bicycle any place with no hesitation. It was wonderful.
We were in Kessler, and I think I was 8 years old, and my brother was 3 when we moved over here. And I've lived here ever since. This is a very stable neighborhood. When we were growing up, we never locked the back door. It was always open.
Oak Cliff, South Dallas, Deep Ellum, the Thomas Hall and State Street area, and Little Mexico are just a few of the neighborhoods that years ago began to add character and a sense of community to this city. Since Dallas began in the 1840s, everyone who has lived here has shared a common dilemma, that of learning to live with the river.
Well, the river is what attracted John Neely Bryan to this area. And the river is key to an understanding of the city of Dallas and its growth and history, I think. Bryan saw the river as a port. One could never imagine that today, looking at the river. But he thought that steamboats would be able to come up the river as far as the site of Dallas.
The Dallas settlers weren't the only ones in the area. Across the river, Judge William Hord started his own town called Hord's Ridge. But in 1850, when Dallas and Hord's Ridge competed for which would be the county seat, Hord's Ridge lost and gradually disappeared. In the 1880s, Thomas Marsalis and a group of developers chose the site for a planned community. They called it Oak Cliff. When Dallas leaders saw what the area had to offer, they claimed it. Oak Cliff was annexed in 1903. Oak Cliff was a wonderful place to be. It had a reputation for its tasty artesian water, as well as for its rich mix of arts and entertainment. Spurred on by the energetic Mr. Charles Mangold, the performing arts offered a lively mix of opera and theater. Crowds gathered for wild amusement rides, as well as roller skating, dancing, and swimming in both Lake Cliff and Kidd Springs. Schools and colleges opened up for both men and women. As Oak Cliff and Dallas flourished, so did some small black neighborhoods.
The black people came in, the first groups started to come in through East Texas, running away from the injustices of slavery, because, see, then Texas was part of Mexico, and Mexico had outlawed slavery. And then the other group came in, they were the slaves who were owned by the settlers, and so you had that group to come in the 1840s. My ancestors came in 1847. They were owned by a man named William Brown Miller. He settled in what we know now as Oak Cliff.
One of the Payton's ancestors was Henry Miller, named after the plantation owners. He was among the first generation born into freedom. He went on to become a farmer, landowner, and preacher. His descendants still gather every year for family reunions. One little Oak Cliff neighborhood, which was started by former slaves, is now called the historic 10th Street District. The graceful but aging spires of the Sunshine Elizabeth Chapel can be seen from the R.L. Thornton Freeway. This chapel was one of two churches located in what was once a close-knit community.
My mother and father came to Dallas in the mid-1920s and settled in the Oak Cliff area. And one of the reasons they settled there, because we had other family members who lived in that community. The only time they have left, they left for 10 years and moved to California. But my mother longed for the 10th Street area and came back to Dallas, and they've been back ever since.
Reunion Tower is a striking landmark on the Dallas skyline. Yet the name comes from across the river, where a small group of Europeans started a utopian colony in 1856. They called their new home La Reunion. It encompassed 2,000 acres in the area of Hampton, Westmoreland, and Davis. Victor Considerant was one of the leaders. He promoted Texas with books describing its ideal climate and fertile soil, good enough for tropical fruits. But then he brought them to Dallas.
They thought they would sail up the river to Dallas, to the site of La Reunion. And they were sorely disappointed, of course, because the Trinity hardly had any water in it. So they arrived here in Dallas in 1856, tired, weary, without any housing or anything. They had to create this utopian community. But the people were not farmers. They were artisans, they were musicians, artists, and they thought they could all share the work and create a community that would be the centerpiece for several other utopian communities.
They were not very successful overall, you know, in terms of being able to survive. But I think what they did do is introduce an element into this area of European sensibilities in a lot of ways. And they were speaking French, and they brought a lot of cultural influences into this area that would not have been here otherwise.
As for the utopians' property, soil tests revealed large deposits of limestone and chalk. So in the early 1900s, cement factories began to operate in the area, and a new kind of colony began, Cement City, which provided housing for company employees.
Yo vine aquí a Dallas con mi hermana y mi cuñado el día 3 de mayo de 1920. Y él fue a trabajar a Cement City, mi cuñado. Y allí me encontré a mi esposo, me casé. En el 1920 también nos tenían a nosotros en un lugar, a los negros en otro. y los americanos en otro. Los tenían divididos a todos y la planta de cemento estaba en medio. Bueno, las familias que vivíamos ahí éramos como una familia todos. Eran como 54, éramos como 54 familias. Era una rueda, hacía un círculo, las casas que teníamos. Y hacíamos un baile cada mes, pagábamos 10 pesos cada uno. Y cada mes teníamos un baile, teníamos un salón que la compañía nos daba.
Of course, in Mother's case, it was different because when my dad lost his sight, they told her that she couldn't live there any longer and she had to move out.
Sí, él trabajó 12 años ahí, pero a los 12 años de trabajar ahí, perdió la vista. Y ya, pues tuvimos que salirnos de ahí.
A lot of people came to Dallas as a result of finding employment there at Cement City. A lot of people came as a result of finding employment with the railroads. My particular family came in 1927 to Dallas because they came to work to clear the trees for the Trinity levee area, and later stayed on to build the bridges, like the bridges for Singleton, Commerce, and later Corinth Street.
From the early days, bridges and ferries were the only ways people could cope with the highs and lows of the Trinity River. When the 1908 flood brought major destruction to both Oak Cliff and Dallas, city leaders decided to look for a better solution. They hired George Kessler, a nationally known city planner from St. Louis. He made many recommendations about everything from railroads to river control. The levee system he suggested rechanneled the Trinity River away from the edge of downtown and made usable about 10,000 acres along what is today Stemmons Freeway. Yet memories still linger about the days when whole sections of the city were underwater.
When the rains would come, in those years, they did not have the levees, and everything would overflow, and on Lamar, the water would rise to 6 or 8 feet, and all the houses there would go underwater, and I can remember seeing boats on Lamar Street coming up Harwood, coming up the various streets in there before they put the levee in.
We used to deliver bread by boat. We'd pile the bread up in the boat and deliver it to the people who couldn't get out of their homes.
While Dallas was building its levees, promoters were still pushing John Neely Bryant's dream of becoming a port city.
And now we come to what is unquestionably the greatest development ever inaugurated in the state of Texas, the so-called Trinity River Project, which involves the dredging of a navigable channel in the Trinity River from Galveston Bay on the Gulf of Mexico through the most thickly populated areas of the state to the great cities of Dallas and Fort Worth, a distance of almost 400 miles.
The river was the inspiration to start Dallas, but railroads were the key to its growth. First to arrive was the Houston and Texas Central. There was heavy competition among railroad lines for business and heavy competition among cities for railroads.
The original route of the railroad was to miss Dallas by 8 miles. The city fathers thought this would be terrible. Well, they must have it come through the city of Dallas. So they went to the railroad officials, petitioned them, offered them $5,000, free right-of-way through the city, and lo and behold, won the railroad. So the H&TC came through Dallas in 1872, a remarkable day for the city.
The Houston and Texas Central was just the first of the railroad jewels in the city's crown. The next year, builders of the Texas and Pacific Railroad tried to bypass Dallas, but local politicians slipped a tricky clause in a bill saying the new line had to cross within a mile of Browder Springs. Only later was it discovered that Browder Springs was located at City Park. Dallasites had themselves another railroad. In the late 1800s, thousands of people migrated west in search of land and opportunity. Railroads made it easier for these immigrants to get to Texas, and Dallas encouraged them to stay. The Eisenlohr family immigrated from Germany in 1846. After growing up in New Braunfels, then Cincinnati, Rudolph Eisenlohr moved to Dallas with his family in 1874.
My great uncle decided that Dallas was going to be a boomtown, and he was a businessman, so Dallas was the place to come. So they moved the whole family down to Dallas. and he was a druggist. He opened his drugstore at the corner of Main and Field in downtown Dallas.
A number of the immigrants were Jewish merchants. Their department stores eventually became Dallas landmarks, with names like Teich, Gettinger, Kahn, Harris, Neiman, and Marcus. But among the first were the Sangers.
You could almost say that the story of the railroad became the story of the Sanger brothers in Texas. And as the railroad inched its way up through central Texas northward, the Sangers would open little stores at each terminus of the railroad. Actually, Alex Sanger was sent from the Corsicana store to Dallas to open the Dallas store. And the first commercial freight to come on the railroad was merchandise from the Corsicana store to the Dallas store for the Sangers. And Alex opened the store here, and then his brother Philip joined him, and they were the two brothers who ran the Dallas Sanger Brothers store.
Alex also had a vision that went beyond Dallas. He started a mail-order business, which quickly became the second largest west of the Mississippi. The success of the Sanger brothers helped to spread the word that Big D was a good place to do business. Later, Sangers merged with A. Harris to form Sanger Harris, and eventually this business was absorbed by another. However, the last Sanger building continues to be a part of downtown. It stands on the corner of Elm and Lamar and now belongs to the Dallas County Community College. One young Sanger employee turned his ideas about retailing into a Dallas legend. In 1907, Herbert Marcus, along with his sister, Carrie Marcus Neiman, and her husband, Al Neiman, saw an opportunity. They gambled that ready-to-wear clothing would soon become more popular than custom-made. As the store grew, it added to the national reputation of Big D. As a family business, it was natural that young Stanley Marcus would follow in his father's footsteps.
Dallas has always been identified in the public mind as part of the Wild West. And I remember when I used to go to Paris or Berlin, be introduced to someone as Stanley Marcus from Dallas, the immediate reaction was they'd point their fingers and say, bang, bang. I decided that we would go into a program of national advertising in Vogue magazine, Harper's Bazaar. And as a result of that, it became newsworthy to a lot of publications because at that time, no one advertised in those magazines except New York stores. I mean, it sounds so silly in 1994 to be thinking that that would be an important factor. But the press had just never looked upon Texas or any other place as a fashion market or fashion source.
New Yorkers may have needed some convincing, but Dallasites knew very well the shopping delights of their own city.
I can name the stores from Teich's to Sanger's, almost name them all, because I made the trip so many times. Starting at Teich's, to Vokes, where we got our shoes, to Green's, H.L. Green's. Let's not forget the dime stores, because Woolworths and Cress's they were in between. A little side trip over to Neiman Marcus, back to Wheels department store, E.M. Can. Let's not forget the music stores, which would be Brooke Mays, Whittle's Music Company. So many beautiful stores. Yes, stores.
One of my favorite memories of downtown Dallas was, I believe it was the 8th floor of Sanger's. It wasn't Sanger Harris, it was just plain Sanger's. At Christmas time, where they had the toys, and there was the department store Santa Claus, and by golly, he was the real thing, no question about it. And that was wonderful to go there at Christmas. My aunt would take us and we'd see the toys and speak to Santa Claus, and that was really a big deal.
I can remember in Dallas back shortly after World War II, some of my fondest memories are around Christmas time and going downtown and seeing the the electric train displays that they had in the big picture windows of the big department stores down there.
Sangers had it always.
And one year they had, it must have been, I don't know, 47, 48, 49, they had it wired so that the train would sit still until you put your hand on the glass. And it would activate something that started that train running, and that fascinated me. I couldn't understand, how does that work? And I'd do that, sit there playing with that train. I would have stayed there for hours, but of course,
Mama said it was time to go.
Right.
Streets full of people, stores full of merchandise, movies, music, and theaters, good food, and good friends. It was all here, downtown. Into the 1950s, trolleys and streetcars were the connecting links between downtown and many of the surrounding neighborhoods. For children, riding on them was like stepping into an imaginary world. And if the child's father worked on them, it was even more wonderful.
I can remember walking up to the streetcar line when I knew he'd be coming by, and maybe my mother would take me when I was little, and we'd wave to my dad. I remember doing that.
It cost 7 cents, and anytime I rode with my grandfather, I had to pay the 7 cents. Now, once I got on, I could ride all day for 7 cents, but you had to put that 7 cents in the fare box. And when I was a little boy, 3 or 4 years old, I think my dad's sister cut down one of his old motorman's uniforms and made it where it fit me. So I had my own motorman's uniform. I was official. And whenever I'd ride with him, I kind of took over the car, you know, of course. But
this is Grandpa's old changer that he had in the streetcar, and I would carry that from one end to the other end and move the seats and help him.
Still works.
Yeah, still works. No money in it.
A lot of people in Dallas in those days depended on the streetcars to get them to and from work, to and from school, to and from doctor's appointments, shopping,
That's
grocery
what I say.
shopping.
See, they didn't
All
have
over town.
cars.
That's right. They didn't. They really relied on them. The
That's
streetcars were like their cars, really.
That's right.
It was an old wooden trestle, 2 tracks, one going to and one going from Oak Cliff. And in the city, of course, the streetcar stopped every corner just about, but there the motorman could really let her rip. And I'm sure it was going very, very slow by current standards, but there was no rail, and so you could look out the window and there was nothing there to see but the Trinity River and the bottoms going lickety-split.
Well,
It was
also,
kind of fun.
on the trestle, you went downhill for a while, and then you would go uphill.
Yeah, that's right, that's right.
So when you were going downhill, you were going very fast, and then, of course, when you got to the bottom and started going up again, it would slow down.
There were many great places to eat downtown, from coffee shops to hotel restaurants. The Adolphus was a favorite choice for special occasions.
When we first came here, my mother tried to take us out once a week, you know, some real nice place. So she would bring us to the main dining room at the Adolphus, which was in this corner here. The Adolphus and the baker were the best in town. And they were the best place to work, too, if you had to work. In the time I worked in the coffee shop, the girls wore white stockings. And they could not wear fingernail polish on their nails. And I had to know how everything was fixed, so I'd go to the cooks first and ask them. And then I'd take them out there, and I had to look to see if they had runners in their hose. Of course, that was silk hose then. After I had Glenn and went back to work, I worked at the Baker Hotel. And that was in 1938. And I stayed there till the first day of 1954. But it was a fun place to work.
When visitors used to come to Big D, they often arrived by train down at Union Station.
If you were to board a passenger train in Dallas in the 1920s, you were traveling the way most people traveled. It was probably taken for granted as much as anything, but it was the safest, most reliable way to go. Looking back on those days, it was also probably the most glamorous and romantic way to travel. All of the cars on the main line trains were full-service dining cars. Everything was cooked right back in the kitchen on board the car. The Katy Railroad actually had an ice cream freezer in the kitchens of their dining cars and made homemade ice cream to serve up to the passengers. And I can remember even in the early 60s, Union Terminal was a very busy place. And you could go up to the track and you could look in the windows of those cars and you could see the flowers on the table in the dining car and you could see the porters making the berths in the sleeping cars, and the sense of urgency to get that train loaded and get it out of the station on time. I mean, you could feel the excitement in the air.
Dallas was the biggest revenue station of the TP Railroad. They were the bread and butter of the TP Railroad. I worked on a switch engine assembly listen for 36 years, mostly right around Fair Park and East Dallas.
Dallas is home to many railroading families. When one generation follows the next, a bond develops that goes beyond words.
I was proud of my father. Not very many sons can work alongside their father and know their grandfather was there. And they still today sit there and they look at me on the railroad and say, that's the third generation railroad.
The railroads brought the first wave of Jewish migration, the merchants who developed the big downtown department stores. At the turn of the century, a second wave arrived. They came from small villages in Eastern Europe, fleeing war and persecution. They settled along the railroad tracks in the vicinity of Harry Hines, Little Mexico, and KERA.
It was affordable housing, and many of them settled in this area. At first, it seemed to have been known as Goose Valley. Later, it became known as Little Jerusalem because of the Jewish population.
Well, the first 4 years of my life was spent around Little Jerusalem. And my mother had just come to Dallas in 1920, and I was born in 1921. And my mother couldn't speak English. So, of course, I grew up only knowing Jewish. And I would go out and try to play with the children. And they couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand them. But of course, eventually I learned English and was able to enjoy their company.
The tracks of the Houston and Texas Central ran along what is today Central Expressway. The tracks of the Texas and Pacific used to run right down Pacific Avenue. Where the two tracks met was a train depot and the opportunity for immigrants to make a living. They realized all of the cargo and passenger activity would be a great place for shoppers and shops.
Elm Street was the location of the beginning little stores that were starting to be built. Many of these early immigrant Jews who were able to open stores, they would help each other when they opened. Used clothing stores, shoe repair stores, pawn shops, cafes, tool shops, any kind of shop imaginable. It was said that you could buy anything in Deep Ellum.
My father did various jobs working on Elm Street, anything that he could find to make a living. When the war broke out, he joined the 36th Infantry Division. When he came back from Europe, he took what few dollars he got from the discharge in his pay and tried to do various things, ended up marrying my mother, and then they opened a small store in the 2800 block on Elm Street.
Actually, they pawned your mother's ring to have enough money to open the store. Pawned her engagement ring.
The pawn shops were all on that area because there was a necessity for it. If a carpenter had a plane or a saw and he needed $1, he could take it down there and borrow it, and then come the middle of next week when he needed it, he'd scrounge around someplace and get that $1 or $3 and go down and take it out of pawn. That was almost a way of life for many people in those days.
With a train depot nearby and a streetcar running down the middle, Elm Street was always open for business. The actual shopping area extended about 4 blocks along Elm, east of what is today Central Expressway. The term Deep Ellum began around the time of Prohibition, when homemade liquor was easy to find. When the blues could be heard everywhere, from street corners to smoke-filled clubs, and when the Harlem Theater and the Ella B. Moore Theater further north put on shows similar to the Apollo in New York.
Let's see, the church-going people, did you see them down on Deep Ellum?
No, sir, that was wrong. That's wrong. That was another time. You're talking about another crowd. No, they wasn't there. This was the good time if people to get down people, that let the hair down and sing the blues.
Very early on, the music scene in Deep Ellum became a serious business. Dallas was one of the key locations in the state for blues and jazz musicians. Allison Tucker first played in Deep Ellum while in high school, on tour with the Houston Band, and returned many times over the years until moving here in the late 50s. Adolphus Sneed began his music studies at Booker T. Washington High School and eventually formed his own combo with Herbie Cowens and the Smith Brothers, Buster and Boston.
The New Orleans type of blues was more of a, horn tooting. They had more horn with theirs, whereas the blues that we're talking about on Deep Ellum, they featured the guitar and had more guitar players and that played the down.
And singers, the vocalists.
Yeah.
Hot Lips Page was just one musician who became famous outside of Dallas, but there were many others like Bud Johnson, Keg Johnson, and Charlie Christian.
Blues is a feeling. It's it's the way you feel, what you feel, and it's a beat. This beat it has to it, that makes you bounce. That after beat, that makes you bounce. Zuzu Boland was working with me at the time. That was strictly Deep Ellum music. It was the same thing that came from Deep Ellum.
Wherever musicians traveled, one of their favorite things to do was jam together after a performance. It was through these connections that word spread about jobs. When big bands up north needed players, they frequently looked to the talent in Deep Ellum.
You'd be surprised at the musician that's left Dallas and the one that's on big time and with the big time band, like Count Basie and Duke and all those people. A lot of those boys out of Dallas. Buster Smith is a good example of what you're saying. When he left here, although he played with several groups, he ended up with Count Basie. He was arranger for Count Basie. He wrote music. Before he left New York, he was writing for different people, and when he came back to Texas, I know people used to get on a plane and fly down here to get Buster to write the music for them. He's right here, one of our Texas boys.
Yes.
Another musician with Deep Ellum roots was Sammy Price, known as the king of boogie woogie. He played with Lester Young and King Curtis and became famous both in the United States and Europe.
What we see now is just in the last few years, would you not say that individuals are beginning to recognize that Deep Ellum was a very, very important part of the history of Dallas.
Yeah.
The tracks that led north from Deep Ellum passed through the Thomas and Hall community, where the Rose Room provided a lively place for musicians and music lovers. For years, the streets in the Thomas and Hall area created a city within a city for its black residents, which is hard to believe looking at so many empty spaces today. The construction of Central Expressway was a major blow for the neighborhood. Later, many of the lots were cleared to make room for real estate developments. In spite of these changes, people's stories keep alive the memory of what was a very special neighborhood.
Some of the motivation to come into the Hall-Thomas area had to do with support of others, primarily because of the fact that there were restrictions with regard to where African Americans could live throughout the county. And as a result of that, you had many blacks who began to come into that area and establish their own businesses.
Grandfather was Dr. L.G. Pinkston, who was the owner of Pinkston's Clinic over on Thomas and Hall. It served the community in that they had the doctors there and the proper care for that particular time right in the community, and you didn't have to go very far. And a lot of times he wasn't paid in money. He was paid in sacks of potatoes, sacks of flowers, cheese, and things like this. I've seen that happen. And it was a community that sort of worked together in the Thomas and Hall area. Everybody sort of knew everybody, and everybody sort of looked out for everybody.
The neighborhood was full of great places to eat. Papa Dad's Barbecue was one of them.
We had to start cooking early, and we cooked all day. We started in the morning and cooked all day and until we closed. And then we served beef, ribs, hot links, and like that.
I remember Papa Dad, he'd get up early in the morning and he'd go and he'd cook off the meat all day long. He would go there and build a big fire, and then he'd throw water on the fire, and that smoke would just go all over the neighborhood, and the people would start coming in. They'd start buying the barbecue because the aroma would go all over North Dallas.
In both the Thomas and Hall area and Deep Ellum, many of the grocery stores were owned by Italian families.
My grandparents were Joe and Pauline Camerata. They came from Sicily, Palermo, Italy. They came through New York and Ellis Island, and it was probably about 1913 at that time. And from New York, they went to Lufkin, Texas, and my grandfather worked in a sawmill there. From there, they came here to Dallas. They bought the store there at Staten Island. And when you walked into the old store from the living room was the meat case. And I can remember Mother doing some of the butchering of the meat. I always felt part of this community, even though we weren't the same color, and that was nice.
Today, St. Paul's United Methodist Church is on one side of Woodall Rogers, and the neighborhood it belonged to is on the other. Churches were a major force in the Thomas and Hall community, although now most have relocated. St. Paul's chose to stay.
This church is 122 years old, been in the same location all those years. 4 generations of my family has attended St. Paul. My dad, myself, my children, and my grandchildren.
Bonnie Medlock began attending St. Paul in the late 50s when she moved to Dallas with her parents. Over the years, she and her husband brought each of their children into the church. Many of these children have married and started their own families. St. Paul's is a physical reminder of the long history of the Thomas and Hall area. The church continues to offer a place for younger generations to create memories of their own. Across Woodall Rogers, there was another neighborhood that once brought vitality to the edge of downtown.
We knew it as Little Mexico. It was a lot of community and a lot of caring, and everybody was sort of an extension of your own family.
One reminder of Little Mexico still shines brightly against the Dallas sky.
Phoenix was the place to be, and the place to work, and the place, where people came, and it was sort of like a landmark. And it had a beautiful dance floor, and I remember those murals on the wall, that it was just something very, very special.
Sadly, one local treasure no longer exists. It began as the Dallas Little Theater. In the early 40s, J.J. Rodriguez converted the building into a movie theater.
The Panamericano Theater was a fun place to go on Sunday afternoons, when we had the money to go and pay. I think it was like a dime or, a quarter to go into the movie house. And I remember Mr. J.J. Rodriguez as somebody that really was a role model, for the young people.
Even as a boy, J.J. Rodriguez dreamed of one day having his own theater. He found special ways to share this love of movies with the children in Little Mexico.
Para Navidad, entonces él
juntaba muchos regalos para niños y para niñas, y entonces procuraba para las 10 de la mañana dar película de Navidad, y daba gratis la entrada para todos los niños, y claro, con las mamás porque iban niños chiquitos. Y entonces regalaba la bolsa de popcorn, dulces, y entonces les daba a cada uno los juguetes. Y para eso él era un gusto.
The theater was a family business, where in the process, the children also learned about the meaning of community.
At that time, he was starting the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. He was helping with the radio stations in Dallas, you know, the Hispanic language radio stations, and El Sol de Texas, the newspapers. And they would have meetings at our theater. I remember they used to come and have meetings in the office upstairs.
As the film industry changed, so did the theater. The Rodriguez family sold it in the early 1980s. Although the new owners quickly tore down the building to prevent any historic preservation action, J.J. Rodriguez never lost his love of movies.
He wanted to show family movies because to him the families were important. I think that that's how I would best like for him to be remembered, is that he was a family man, but a family man of the Hispanic community.
Stories about Little Mexico, the Thomas and Hall area, Deep Ellum, and back to the early days of Little Jerusalem create a ring of memories around downtown, memories that continue to inspire us and inform us. It's easy to look at old photos, see old buildings, and perhaps overlook how the story behind some of these structures changed the future of the city.
Behind us is the sparkling new Federal Reserve Bank. It's one of 12 regional banks in the United States, and it's the result of a major effort that was made way back in 1914, just after the Federal Reserve Bank Act was passed.
Dallas leaders jumped at the opportunity to become the site of a regional bank. Even though the city was much smaller than its competitors, the leaders used all the political tricks they could.
For instance, they heard that an important committee member was coming to Texas by train. So a Dallas Morning News reporter, a banker named J. Howard Audrey, went up to St. Louis to intercept this committee member, Burleson was his name, to have a special car on the train so they could entertain him in royal fashion all the way to Dallas. They made a terrific pitch to him, and finally it was announced that Dallas had won that distinction.
On April 3rd, 1914, beneath the headline, Dallas was depicted as the gallant suitor walking off with the lovely maiden, Miss Federal Reserve Bank.
When this announcement was made, all sorts of celebrations rang out. Dallas had arrived. Dallas was the city of the hour. The Council of Churches declared a day of prayer so that we could thank God for the fact that Dallas got the Federal Reserve Bank. And Dallas was the smallest city in the nation to win that honor.
The Federal Reserve Bank brought more than honor to Dallas. The millions of dollars of deposits attracted large private banks, and Dallas became the banking center of the Southwest.
For many years, Dallas didn't know whether it was a western city or a southern city, and actually it was part of both. I mean, there was a cattle trail coming to Dallas, the Shawnee Trail. It was part of the Old South, and yet it really wanted to be something very distinctive in its own right. Well, the opportunity came along in 1936 when Texas celebrated its 100th anniversary of independence, and we knew there was going to be a big exposition held at some city in the state of Texas. Dallas had small claim to it because, after all, in 1836, there was no Dallas.
In the mid-1930s, several big construction projects were underway, including work on the levees and the triple underpass, which would serve as a grand entry into the city. But Dallas leaders had another major project in mind, the state's centennial exhibition. Armed with facts, figures, and money, they beat out the competition. Dallas was proud of this achievement, and doubly proud when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt drove onto the fairgrounds for the opening ceremonies.
My friends of Texas, I have come here today to bear the tribute of the nation to you on your 100th birthday, for you are 100 years young.
And what a birthday party. A huge $25 million exposition in Dallas with all Texas playing host. 200 acres of magnificent buildings, a new city, a great city, a city of 1,000 sights and 1,000 wonders. Small wonder, then, that the whole nation is talking about this big Texas exposition.
People came from all over the country. Some even rode the special Centennial trains. There were exhibits for all ages.
Anything fishy here? Why, yes, it's the aquarium. And take a look at these, the spoonbill catfish. Imagine trying to spoon with that bill.
There was this outdoor theater production called The Cavalcade of Texas, which was a capsule summary of Texas history, beginning with the Indians and then the Spanish and so forth, and ending up with cowboys and Indians and the Texas Revolution and the Alamo, with lots of horses and guns shooting and arrows flying, and it was just fabulous I was about 6 at that time.
The Centennial Exposition put Dallas in the news around the country. Big D was becoming known as a city with spunk and character. However, behind the scenes, Bob Thornton, the Mercantile Bank president, had to use all of his persuasive powers to get local business leaders to contribute thousands of dollars every week to meet the Centennial's payroll.
He finally said, fellas, don't send your vice presidents these meetings. I ain't got time for them. Send your presidents. I only want to see yes men. As a result of that technique, the Citizens Council emerged from this group of yes men who would come in and put up the money. And we figured that if it worked well for the fair, it would work well for the city. Later on, the Citizens Council became characterized as an oligarchy, which it was. Certainly it was not a democratic method of supervision, but it was a lot more efficient than the democratic system.
The Centennial, of course, was an element of the establishment, the leading bankers who wanted it brought to Dallas. Well, the black people of Dallas were somehow left out. But at this very time in the history of Dallas, you had people like Maceo Smith and Maynard Jackson who had come together and had begun organizing the blacks into groups such as the Progressive Voters League. Maceo Smith was head of the Negro Chamber of Commerce, and Maceo Smith in particular decided that the black culture should be represented at the Centennial. And they started trying to raise money, gather materials. He went to Smith and some of the others went to the legislature to see if they could get a sum of money to put up a building for Negroes.
Well, the 1936 Centennial was one of the kinds of political battles that had to be fought in order to get representation of the African-American community, or the presence of the African-American community reflected in that very historic celebration through Fair Park.
The Hall of Negro Life was a monument to the perseverance of African-American leaders. They were refused state funding when they would not withdraw a black candidate from a legislative race. Eventually, with money they gathered from among themselves and a grant from the federal government, the hall was built.
Juneteenth, 1936, was a day that we were finally allowed to come in. We could come to the Centennial, we could come to the fair, but we couldn't ride anything, we couldn't eat anything, but we could pay our money and come in, but we could go into that Negro building.
The Centennial had been so successful that the city decided to put on another exposition called the Pan American Exposition. Now, some people came to the city fathers again and said, well, the Hall of Negro Life does not fit in with the theme of this year's exposition. And so it was demolished. It was the only substantial building that was demolished from 1936 to 1937.
In the early 1990s, a community-wide effort returned the building to the site. The Museum of African American Life and Culture is a proud symbol of persistence and celebration. Memories of the Centennial soon faded as the country entered World War II. However, after the war, the struggle for civil rights intensified. South Dallas was one of the first neighborhoods to become openly involved in conflict.
This is Rutledge Street in South Dallas, just off 2nd Avenue and just down from Fair Park. And my earliest memories are right at this location at the house just behind us. Just outside the house was a tall white fence. It was tall to me at the time, and I'm certain it was quite tall, and a solid wooden fence. And I was told, and I'm certain that this is true, that it was the dividing line between the black families and the white families. For on this other side of the fence over here, all the people who lived there were black.
For years, Dallas was a racially divided city. Certain areas were designated for Negroes and for Mexicans. A study in the 1940s showed that 1 out of 3 black families was living doubled up with another family because there wasn't enough housing for them. After World War II, the housing shortage everywhere was so critical that it was considered to be a threat to business development. When some black families began moving into white South Dallas neighborhoods, they were met with violence. The Gully family moved here from the Thomas and Hall area.
Hatcher Street Florist is the oldest black florist in Dallas. And when we moved out in '43, we had 2 bombings we went through during the period from '44-45. That it completely destroyed the greenhouse on the second time. The first time, it just kind of burned it up real bad, but it was enough to shatter windows everywhere and make you get up out of your bed.
One time I did live in South Dallas in the 1950s. That was when South Dallas had just started to integrate. And we were warned as children to look out for the night riders because South Dallas at that time, the people were bombing the houses over there. They were bombing some of the early businesses. This was the early 1950s. And they didn't want black people to move into South Dallas.
There were arrests, but no convictions. However, with the combination of grand jury investigations, a new anti-bomb law, and public outrage, the attacks ended.
Now, the white families who were living here started moving out. A large number of them moved to Pleasant Grove. That's where my family went, out 2nd Avenue. It was a logical extension. The Jewish families who lived along Forest Avenue, now Martin Luther King Boulevard, tended to move north toward Hillcrest High School in the area where Temple Emmanuel is today.
Housing was just one of many issues that needed work on both federal and local levels. For years, the Dallas City Council was shaped and directed by the behind-the-scenes decisions of the Citizens Council. As the city changed, so did this process. The vote to switch to a city council based on 14 single-member districts was a landmark event. It brought together 2 groups that had been in a tense relationship ever since the days of the 1936 centennial.
It's Monday afternoon at Dallas City Hall. The predominantly white Citizens Council and the predominantly African-American Progressive Voters League are making history.
Though we haven't always agreed on all issues, this is an issue where we are arm in arm and absolutely in agreement on what's best for the people of this city.
Sometimes change is gradual. At other times, it is sudden and tragic. Big D has seen both. In November 1960, when John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were running for office, right-wing protesters screamed insults at LBJ and Lady Bird during a campaign event in Dallas. In October of 1963, right-wing protesters attacked Adlai Stevenson after he spoke at the United Nations Day rally. After such bad press, local leaders tried to stage a warm welcome for President Kennedy and his wife. What happened next put Dallas in the headlines and the history books.
There were many different types of emotions going on. There were people who grieved, like the people from all over the world were grieving. There were others who were defiant, who felt Dallas was being blamed for something that was not the fault of Dallas. Everybody who lived in Dallas had some participation in that horrible event by not having spoken up at an earlier time when the evidences of hatred were being incubated in the city.
But they decided, the city did, it should moderate its views. And suddenly the right-wing elements were quiet. Eric Johnson became mayor, started the Goals for Dallas program, which involved people from all walks of life to talk about the future of Dallas, what kind of city do we want. And the city, there's no doubt about it, became much more moderate after the assassination.
This is our city. At first glance, we see the changes, but not the history. Until, that is, we begin to listen and share our stories of generations gone by, of faraway places and long-ago journeys. We learn that we are the dreamers, the laborers, the railroad workers. We are the teachers, the storytellers, the musicians. We are the movie owners, the retailers, the community supporters. We are the children of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The promise of Big D is here, in who we are and how well we live with each other, as we each seek our own opportunities in this city by the river.